A woman in Oklahoma sends off a DNA kit expecting to confirm what her grandmother always told her. Instead, she gets a result that contradicts 100 years of paperwork. A tribal roll from 1907 says her family is one thing. Her genome says something else. Who was told his whole life that his family's freedman label was just bureaucratic bad luck, opens his own results and finds the exact same signal his cousins on the bi-blood side carry. Same region, same ancestors. 2. Completely different legal categories. Right now, in labs from Cambridge to Norman, Oklahoma, geneticists are pulling apart the DNA of self-identified Native American families and finding something that official enslaved ancestors, freed ancestors, ancestors who were fully, legally, and culturally part of a tribe, and then were written out of it by a pen instead of a chromosome. This is not a fringe theory. It is published, peer-reviewed science, sitting quietly in a journal most people have never opened. And once you understand how it happened, you will never look at a tribal enrollment card the same way again. Before anything else, it is worth being clear about what kind of science this actually is. The core data here comes from the American Journal of Human Genetics, from a 2015 study led by geneticist Katarzyna Breik, working with a team that included population, geneticist David Reich of Harvard Medical School and Joanna Mountain, then head of research at the consumer genetics company 23andMe. Their paper analyzed the genomes of over 5,000 self-identified African Americans and more than 148,000 European Americans, using autosomal DNA, the kind inherited in blocks from both parents, to reconstruct exactly how much African, European, and Native American ancestry runs through modern American populations, state by state. This is not a hobbyist ancestry test guessing at percentages for entertainment. This is peer-reviewed population genetics, cross-checked against historical migration records, and it forms the backbone of almost everything genetic genealogists now understand about mixed ancestry in the American Southeast. That same pattern was later independently confirmed by a separate research team publishing in PLOS Genetics, which traced the same Native American ancestry signal inside African-descended populations back to a single geographic origin in the Southeastern United States, rather than scattered coincidence. 2 different teams, 2 different papers, pointing at the same buried history. None of this research comes from a fringe blog or self-published theory. It comes from institutions with names people recognize, published under peer review, sitting in the same academic pipeline that produces cancer research and vaccine studies, which is exactly why it carries the weight it does. Before the real answer, it helps to walk through what most people already believe, because each of those beliefs is doing some real work, even when it turns out to be incomplete. The first is the idea that Native nations were untouched by slavery, that the whole slaveholding chapter of American history belongs entirely to the plantation South, and has nothing to do with tribal history. It is a comforting story because it keeps colonization and slavery as 2 separate tragedies instead of one tangled one, but the historical record does not support it. The Cherokee, Muskogee Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations, the same 5 tribes forced west on the Trail of Tears, held enslaved people of African descent before removal, and continue to do. So afterward, in what became Indian territory, some of those slaveholders were themselves of mixed Cherokee and European descent, running plantations that looked, on paper, almost identical to their counterparts in Georgia and Alabama. The theory gets real credit for capturing half the truth. Native nations were victims of one of the greatest forced removals in American history. It simply is not the whole truth, because some of the people forced onto that same Trail of Tears were, at the very same time, holding other human beings in bondage. The second popular idea is that the freed people who ended up living among these tribes were unrelated outsiders, adopted in later, almost as an afterthought, with no real blood connection to Native families at all. This version is comforting for a different reason. It lets modern tribal citizens draw a clean line between us and them, a line the Dawes Commission itself tried to draw with a pen at the turn of the 20th century. But genealogical and genetic evidence tells a messier story. Family lines braided together for generations before removal, through marriage, through cohabitation, through children who had a Cherokee mother and an enslaved father, or a Creek father and an enslaved mother. The theory of 2 separate, unconnected populations survives on paperwork. It collapses the moment you follow an actual family tree back more than 2 generations. The third belief is maybe the most stubborn, that tribal citizenship has always tracked biology, that by blood on an old enrollment card is a scientific measurement rather than a political one. This is the myth that does the most damage because it convinces people that history was simply recording nature. It was not. The Dawes Rolls, compiled between 1898 and 1914 to break up communal tribal land into individual allotments, sorted people, into categories like Cherokee by blood and freedmen using observation, hearsay, and The racial assumptions of turn-of-the-century clerks, not laboratory analysis of any kind. Two siblings with the same Cherokee mother and the same enslaved father could be enrolled under two different categories, depending on how light or dark their skin appeared to the agent standing in front of them that day. None of these three beliefs get you to the deeper answer. They get you close, they explain a partial history, a comforting boundary, an official category, but the real story sits underneath all three, in the DNA itself, and that is where we go next. To understand what the genetic data is actually showing, it helps to think about autosomal DNA the way you'd think about a recipe, rather than a single ingredient. When two people from very different populations have children, the resulting genome is not a smooth 50-50 blend, like paint mixing into a single new color. It is closer to a patchwork quilt, stitched together from large chunks inherited whole from each parent, each chunk carrying a genetic signature that scientists can trace back to a broad ancestral region. West Africa, Western Europe, the Americas. Every generation, those chunks get shuffled and cut into smaller pieces through a process called recombination, but they never fully dissolve. That is what let Bryce and her colleagues take a saliva sample from someone in Tulsa in 2014 and detect fragments of ancestry from events that happened 200, 300, 400 years earlier. It is genetic archaeology, reading a person's chromosomes the way you'd read tree rings, except the rings are inherited from thousands of ancestors at once instead of a single trunk. Think about the scale of what that actually means for a second. A person alive today has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and 16 great-great-grandparents. Go back roughly 250 years to right around the time the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations were first being pushed toward the Mississippi. And that same person has somewhere in the range of 1,000 direct ancestors sitting at that generational depth. Every single one of them contributed at least a small, traceable chunk to the genome sitting in a saliva tube today. A DNA lab is not reading one grandmother's story. It is reading a compressed archive of 1,000 different lives, all layered on top of each other, all still technically present, waiting for the right software to sort them back into categories a historian can recognize. So, quick recap before we go further, because the pieces are about to start moving fast. We know Native nations in the Southeast held enslaved people before and after removal. We know freed and enslaved families intermarried with Native families for generations, not as outsiders, but as relatives. And we know the government's own enrollment process sorted people by sight, not by science. Hold on to those 3 threads, because the DNA is about to show you exactly where they collide, and it starts in the one state built specifically to absorb both groups at once, Oklahoma. Here's the part that connects everything back to that woman in Oklahoma. The 2015 study found something specific and frankly striking about the state where she lives. Bryce's team discovered that Oklahoma has the highest concentration of African Americans carrying significant Native American ancestry anywhere in the United States, a pattern the researchers traced directly to the demographic collision that happened when the Trail of Tears forcibly relocated tens of thousands of Native people into a territory that, at the exact same time, held a substantial enslaved black population. 2 displaced groups forced into overlapping. Geography by the same government policy, inevitably intermarried, had children, and built families that don't sort cleanly into the racial boxes drawn by outsiders. That single finding is the genetic fingerprint of a history that official tribal roles tried very hard to keep separate on paper. Here's where it gets more specific, and where the human cost of that separation becomes impossible to ignore. Long before the Dawes Commission ever showed up with its ledgers, the Cherokee Nation signed a treaty with the United States in 1866 in the aftermath of the Civil War that did something remarkable for its time. Article 9 of that treaty freed the people the Cherokee Nation had held in slavery, as many as 2,500 of them, and granted them and all their descendants all the rights of native Cherokees. Not a special category, not a lesser tier, the same rights. 2,500 people freed by a single article of a single treaty. That is not an abstraction. That is 2,500 individual family lines, still growing today, still tangled into the same tribal genealogy that produced everyone else enrolled in that same census. For decades after 1866, that promise held. Freedmen families were enrolled, voted, held office, and lived as citizens of the Cherokee Nation, and Black Seminoles similarly fought and lived alongside Seminole communities in Florida and later in Indian Territory, forming some of the tribe's most effective military allies against U.S. forces during the Seminole Wars. This was not a footnote. It was daily, lived, documented tribal life for generations. The Black Seminoles in particular built entire communities inside Seminole territory, with their own leaders, their own settlements, and enough military value that U.S. commanders during the Seminole Wars specifically identified them as some of the hardest fighters they faced, precisely because they were defending family, not just territory. Some of those same Black Seminole leaders negotiated directly with federal officials on behalf of the tribe, a level of trust and integration that doesn't fit the story of a population kept at arm's length. In the next part of this, we go straight into the moment that history quietly gets rewritten, not by an army, not by a war, but by a filing cabinet. When the Dawes Commission carved communal land into individual allotments, tribal citizens were sorted into by blood rolls and freedmen rolls, and that single administrative choice made by federal clerks working off appearance and testimony rather than any laboratory tool became the legal foundation for who counted as real Cherokee for the next 100 years. In 1983, the Cherokee Nation formally required that new members trace their ancestry only through the by blood roll, cutting freedmen descendants out of citizenship entirely, even when their family trees ran straight back to Cherokee grandmothers documented in the tribe's own historical records. For over 3 decades, thousands of families who could trace unbroken lineage to citizens of the Cherokee Nation, families with native great-great-grandparents named in the tribe's own archives, were told officially that they did not belong. That is the moment where the genetics and the genealogy start pointing at each other. Descendants of Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole freedmen who submitted DNA tests through consumer platforms in the 2010s began surfacing exactly the pattern Bryce's team had already documented at the population level: Native American ancestry sitting quietly inside genomes that a piece of federal paperwork had long ago filed under a different label. It is not that the DNA discovered something the families themselves never knew. Many of these families had passed down oral history about a Cherokee grandmother, a Creek great-grandfather for generations. What the DNA did was confirm, in hard, replicable laboratory terms, what a government ledger had spent a century denying. The story does not stop at the 5 tribes. Further east, in the swamps and river bottoms of North Carolina, the Lumbee people have carried a similarly tangled ancestry for centuries, a population historians and genealogists describe as descending from a mix of Indigenous, European, and African lines that formed long before the modern racial categories used to sort them even existed. And in the mountains of Appalachia, a separate mixed ancestry community known as the Melungeons offers almost a mirror image of the same phenomenon. A 2012 study published in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, led by genetic genealogist Roberta Estes, analyzed Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA from documented Melungeon family lines and found the paternal ancestry was overwhelmingly sub-Saharan African and European, with the long-cherished family legend of Native American or even Portuguese origin largely unsupported in the direct male line. In one direction, families labeled freedmen turn out to carry documented Native ancestry the paperwork denied them. In the other direction, families that told themselves a story about native or Mediterranean roots turn out, genetically, to be something else entirely, an early, hidden mixture of black and white ancestors, quietly folded into a different identity because claiming it directly was never safe. That is not one isolated family legend, and it is not a coincidence either. It is a pattern repeating itself across an entire region in 2 opposite directions for the same underlying reason. Race in early America was never just a biological fact. It was a survival strategy, applied differently depending on which direction kept a family safest, and DNA does not know the difference between the story a family told the census taker to stay alive and the one quietly recorded in their own chromosomes the whole time. Quick recap, because we're closing in on the part that actually changed people's lives. So far, we've seen the population level signal in Oklahoma, the treaty language that once guaranteed equal citizenship, the filing. Cabinet decision that quietly undid it, and now 2 mirror image communities, the Lumbee and the Melungeons, showing the same mixed ancestry pattern playing out. And that sets up the one question that actually had to be answered in a courtroom, not a lab. After a century of being told they didn't belong, could the freedmen descendants get their citizenship back? Let's bring it back to what this actually means for identity today, because this is the part that carries real weight for real people. When the descendants of Cherokee freedmen took their case to federal court, seeking recognition of the citizenship rights their great-grandparents once held, the argument was never really about DNA at all. It was about the 1866 treaty and whether the Cherokee Nation's own promise still bound it. In August of 2017, U.S. District Judge Thomas Hogan ruled in the case Cherokee Nation vs. Nash that the Cherokee Nation was bound by that treaty, writing that the Cherokee freedmen's right to citizenship in the Cherokee Nation is directly proportional to Native Cherokee's own right to citizenship. 4 years later, in 2021, the Cherokee Nation Supreme Court went further, striking the words "by blood" from the tribe's constitution entirely. In 2025, the Muskogee Nation's O.N. High Court followed a nearly identical path, ruling that freedmen descendants of that nation also hold citizenship rights under their own 1866 treaty. The genetics didn't win either case. The treaties did. But the genetics explain, in granular, chromosome-level detail, exactly why the treaty language mattered so much in the first place. Because the people fighting for citizenship were never outsiders asking to be let in. Many of them were insiders whose own family's native ancestry had simply been reclassified out of existence by a government clerk's snap judgment generations earlier. It's worth sitting with how strange that is. A population can carry a piece of ancestry in every single cell of their body, passed down faithfully, generation after generation, completely unconcerned with what any government form says about it, while an entire legal and cultural system insists otherwise for 100 years. The DNA never lied. It just wasn't being asked the question. Now, to be clear about what this evidence can and cannot do, because this is the part that gets flattened in a lot of retellings, and it deserves better than that. Population-level genetic ancestry, the kind documented in the Bright study, the PLOS genetics follow-up, and the Melungeon Y-DNA research, is not the same thing as individual courtroom-grade proof of descent from one specific named ancestor. Nobody dug up a 19th century Cherokee grandmother and ran a direct genetic match against her remains, and no one is claiming that happened. What these studies show is that entire populations carry the traceable genetic signature of historical intermixing at scale across specific regions, in patterns that line up precisely with documented historical events like the Trail of Tears and the presence of enslaved people in evidence. It is not the same as saying any one individual's DNA can prove their exact place on a specific family tree without the paper genealogy to back it up alongside it. Tribal citizenship in the United States is also not simply a biological category to begin with. It is a political and legal relationship defined by each sovereign nation's own laws and treaties, which is exactly why the freedmen. Cases were decided in federal and tribal courts based on treaty text, not in a genetics lab based on a saliva sample. DNA can illuminate history. It cannot by itself rewrite tribal law, and it was never trying to. There's also a question worth sitting with about what these tests can say about specific historical individuals, as opposed to entire populations. Nobody involved in this research has ever claimed to have tested the actual remains of a specific 19th century Cherokee enslaver or a specific enslaved ancestor and matched them directly to a living descendant. For most families in this story, no such remains exist to test in the first place. What the science can responsibly say is narrower and in some ways more honest, that the population a family belongs to carries a documented, dated genetic signature consistent with the specific historical events their oral history already described. That distinction matters because collapsing population-level ancestry into proof about one named person is exactly the kind of overreach that gives good science a bad reputation. And this story does not need the exaggeration to be compelling on its own. So where does that leave the woman who opened that envelope in Oklahoma, staring at a result that didn't match the roll number her family had been given 100 years earlier? It leaves her holding two different kinds of truth at once. One truth is written and made a judgment call in a matter of seconds. The other is written in a molecule that has been quietly, faithfully copying itself inside her cells since before that ledger existed, indifferent to which box someone else decided to check. History spent a century trying to keep those two truths apart. Science, almost by accident, just handed them back to each other. Somewhere in that gap between the paperwork and the chromosome is where a family finally gets to tell its own story again, on its own terms, with the receipts finally on its side. Not because a lab discovered something new, but because a lab finally gave an old, patiently repeated family story, the kind of evidence a courtroom and a tribal government could no longer wave away. It is not a story about scandal, and nobody in it needs to be unmasked. It is a story about a line on a form that was never as final as it looked, and about how patient a chromosome can be, while it waits for someone to finally ask it the right question. Tell me in the comments which part hit you harder. The discovery that the Trail of Tears and slavery in Indian Territory happened in the same place at the same time, or the fact that a single clerk's guess 100 years ago is still shaping who gets called family today.